Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 194, and I am the show's host, Kyle. Joining me on today's show is Will Porter. Will Porter is a frequent guest of the show. He is a freelance journalist, and his work can be found at antiwar.com, libertarianinstitute.org, consortiumnews.com. Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Kyle. Thanks for having me back on again. How are you?
No problem. Doing well. I was just looking today, we're coming up on the 200th episode of the show, and I think Will's been on about 20 of them, so 10% of the shows.
Yeah.
Will's work has been a big feature of the show, and his analysis and commentary on these important issues has been really helpful throughout. So, Will, thanks so much for being on, and for those of you who really enjoy Will's work, you should check out his Patreon page. What is it? Was it /
It's patreon.com/WKP journalist. And I really appreciate that, man. I've been glad to come on the show every time.
No problem. And you have a similar Twitter, which is, what is it, Will?
It's at WKP ANCAP, ANCAP.
All right. Well, thanks for giving us that information. And, the reason I'm having you on the show today is a really important issue. And it's been, for a foreign policy issue, it's gotten some good amount of media attention. And that's what's going on in Israel, specifically, on the 14th of May. It got some attention with the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. And then maybe a little bit in the shadow of that, the Gazan protests got quite a bit of attention as well.
Right.
But, I'm hoping that Will could really put this whole thing in context for us today. And so we're going to take it back really to pre-Israel time. And Will, just kind of open up by telling us who lived in what is now Israel before Israel was there.
Yeah, sure. So I think with issues like this, especially when they have such relevance to, current events, current affairs, it is really important and vital to know the history. And so I'll try to just give some broad strokes to explain sort of the context and the history behind what is called the Nakba, which in Arabic means the catastrophe. And so, as you asked, who lived in this area that we call Palestine? Well, it was mostly Arabs for hundreds and hundreds of years. Prior to the First World War, it was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And after the First World War, it fell under the control of what's called the British Mandate. And so, as I said, after the First World War, the French and the British sort of divided control of the Middle East and the Levant amongst themselves. And this is called the Mandate system. And England basically got Iraq and Palestine, and for a second that included Transjordan, and then France got Syria and Lebanon. And so after the First World War, the British basically promised the Arabs living in this area, the Palestinians, promised them, for decades, independence, basically, that someday you will have your own state and you'll live independently. However, soon after the British Mandate took hold over Palestine, certain powerful figures in the United Kingdom were very partial to what was then called the Zionist project. And Zionism is, of course, an ideology that advocates for Jewish nationalism, so looking for a Jewish homeland. And so, for example, in 1917, very soon after the First World War, the UK Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter to a Zionist sort of bigwig in the Zionist movement named Lord Rothschild and approved the project of Zionism, approved of making Palestine the Jewish state. And so the Jews had basically always seen Palestine as their homeland, their ancient ancestral homeland, but it wasn't really till the late 1800s when the Zionist movement started looking for a place to actually establish like a Jewish state as a homeland. And so, Zionist settlers began settling Palestine in the late 1800s, but it wasn't until a little bit later that the movement would become militant. And these sort of militant Zionist leaders would then slowly try to take as much control of Palestine for their state as possible. And all the while, as you said, there were Arabs living here. And so there's an indigenous population. And so that's just the broadest strokes, is that the Zionists were after Palestine, the British promised the Palestinian Arabs independence, and effectively they didn't get it. And the Zionists ended up with their state.
All right. And so we also have, I think the UN gets involved and the League of Nations gets involved here. Will, can you explain their involvement, really, I guess, leading up to 47 now?
Yeah, sure. So, right now we're still talking about pre-Nakba times. We're talking about before the creation of the State of Israel. And so, as I mentioned, the British and French mandate system, this was basically run through the League of Nations. And so I think that's a pretty large role of the international community there, was basically like facilitating the mandate system of the British and French domination of Palestine, or of the Middle East, I should say. Now later it would be the United Nations, the successor organization to the League of Nations, that would recommend for the partition of Palestine. And sort of that was in an attempt to sort of accommodate both the wants of the indigenous Arab population as well as the wants of the Zionist movement. And so it was really the international community that went in and tried to raise the issue of partition. And now the international community, I think, had a lot of responsibility here in this whole process of negotiating partition, because basically the Arabs boycotted the partition process, the negotiations. And so basically the Zionists, like the UN only heard the maximalist demands of the Zionists. And I think they sort of made an error there in not making more of an attempt to bring the Palestinians and the Arabs into the negotiations. And so basically the UN ended up rubber stamping and approving of giving about 60% of Palestine to the Zionist movement. That was sort of like the proposed partition plan. And at this time, Jews made up about 1/3 of the Palestinian population and owned only about 6% of the property. But yet they were being offered more than 60% of the country in this partition plan. And so I would say the international community really rubber stamped a project which, several American and British studies had found was probably not workable. The Zionist project in Palestine, several studies in the past had found was probably going to involve a lot of violence and injustice. And effectively, the UN rubber stamped that. And so I would say that's like the major role of the international community in this whole thing.
Okay, and so this really brings us to 1947. And Will, do you want to explain to us the very important events that happened in that year?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the United Nations basically, and it wasn't only the UN, it was prior, as I referred to these studies, it was sort of there's something from 1936 that the British did called the Peel Commission, and there's something from 1938 called the Woodhead Commission, kind of recommending and trying to figure out what to do with Palestine. And this is where the idea of partition sort of took hold. And so then the UN sort of took those ideas and ran with them. And in November of 1947, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed what's called Resolution 181. And this is the recommendation for the partition of Palestine. And so this is a huge deal. The Arabs had in the past revolted over sort of perceptions that the international community and the British were being partial to the Zionists. And again, after the passage of Resolution 181, the Arabs did revolt. And this would sort of involve a lot of vandalism and sort of civil unrest. And that civil unrest would basically the proto-Israelis, the Zionists living in Palestine before the creation of the State of Israel, they responded to that civil unrest with what is called the Nakba, which is a massive ethnic cleansing and expulsion campaign, which saw 750,000 Palestinian Arabs expelled from their homes and their home villages. And some 500 villages were either taken over or completely destroyed. And so that is really what we call the catastrophe or the Nakba. And it was this expulsion and destruction of villages of the Palestinian people.
Right. And, I'm going to link to an article in the show notes page that was published on antiwar.com by Ramsey Baroud, who is a Palestinian who I believe grew up in Gaza and then the United States. But his family is from one of these small villages or towns where his family fled in fear of, I guess, being killed in one of these massacres. And then the village was destroyed and his family lived in Gaza from then on. And so you could, I guess just get that perspective of what it was like from one of the victims of the Nakba.
Sure, yeah. Ramsey Baroud is great. I would definitely recommend his writing.
Okay, Will. You paint this narrative and you say, that the Israelis pushed the Palestinians off of their land. But, if you listen to Fox News or if you talk to somebody who's pro-Israel that, is even maybe a little bit more intellectual than a Fox News viewer, they'll tell you, well, this was a Israeli reaction to Arab aggression. What do you have, I guess, to combat that or, to, show your side, or the Palestinian side here?
Sure. Yeah, so you'll hear often, like, all kinds of objections and criticisms to the history that I just explained. Some people might just outright deny it, but I think they're less important to respond to because they're not really receptive to facts. They'll just deny history. However, there's a sort of narrative that goes along the lines that often pro-Israel people accept and push. And this line of argument basically goes that, the Palestinians started a war with the Israelis, and they were backed by 5 Arab armies, and that the Jews miraculously defeated this invasion, and that the Nakba, this expulsion and this violence, destruction of villages and stuff, they claim that the Nakba happened in that context and as a response of some kind of Arab invasion. And I just don't think that can be squared with the facts, though. First of all, if you look at Israeli archives, there's a great historian named Ilan Pappe who wrote a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And his entire book is really primarily sourced on Israeli archives and documents. The documents of what was called the Haganah, which was like the Israeli military before they had the IDF and before they had the State of Israel. And so Haganah archives show that for months there had been meticulous planning for an expulsion campaign long before the UN Resolution 181 was passed. And so that doesn't make any sense. Israel could not have just been responding to this Arab unrest after the passage of the resolution if they had been planning for it for months prior. And so there's a very clear documentation that shows that there was, very meticulous planning. There was, surveillance of villages and getting all these informants and getting every last little detail about, the village's inhabitants and their politics and everything. And so it was a very meticulous plan to surveil villages and Palestinian life. Another thing I think that sort of cuts against this narrative is because it's claimed that the 5 Arab armies invaded Israel and that Israel just responded, and that was what the Nakba was their response. But actually, if you look at the Arab League, who sent in not 5 entire Arab armies, they sent in a combined force from 5 armies. So just to clarify that. But right around the date of the Declaration of Independence for Israel, I think it was, I forget the exact date, was it May 15th, 1948, I think? But right on that day, the Arab League issued a resolution or issued a declaration explaining their position. And in that resolution, the Arab League refers to expulsions and massacres as its reason for getting involved in the first place. And so how could the Arab League cite that as its reason for getting involved in the first place if that was things that if that was a response from the Israelis? You understand what I'm saying? Like, the Arabs, before they ever even got involved, the Arab League, could not be referring to expulsions and massacres if those expulsions and massacres occurred as a result of the Arab League getting involved. The chronology just doesn't make sense. And so we have documentation historically that shows very clearly what the order of events was here.
All right. The other thing I'll sometimes hear, somebody will hear that they have no way to refute it, and they'll say, yeah, but your numbers are high, and maybe there was a town or two destroyed, and some Israeli soldiers maybe got a little outside at will, and they killed some people they shouldn't have, but this wasn't a mass scale kind of thing. And then those 1 or 2 isolated events provoked an overreaction from the Arab League. And so I don't know. Well, what evidence do you have, or what sources do you cite? As to your figures on how many, Palestinians were pushed out.
Yeah, I would refer again to this historian, and again, he's an Israeli historian. This is an Israeli Jew, so this isn't just like, you can't write it off quite as easily as being Arab propaganda or something. And his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which relies on Israeli archives, that's where a lot of these numbers come from. And in fact, in that book, he goes through very detailed and shows the number of massacres that actually took place. It wasn't just like Deir Yassin or whatever. That's the one that's often cited. But there's a lot of extreme violence that took place. And in terms of saying that the Arab League overreacted, well, I mean, they sent in a pretty pitiful force, really. Like, I think the Arab League could be criticized for not offering a more robust defense of the people they were claiming to be responsible for. Of course, the British had a lot of responsibility there. Their mandate was technically still in place when the Nakba was taking place. It ended very soon after. But getting back to the Arab, alleged overreaction, I don't believe any Arab force actually entered what is called Israel proper at all. In fact, I think they actually only were involved in what was then considered Palestinian territory. And so in terms of some kind of overreaction, I don't think you can really make that case.
All right. And at this point, Will, kind of post-Nakba, maybe we're, into 48, 49 or whatever, where are kind of the borders of Israel versus Palestine? When we look at that, kind of classic map where there's that kind of larger cutout for Gaza and the almost backwards B for the West Bank that stretches to East Jerusalem. Is that what we're looking at here?
Yeah, I think that's generally where after the Nakba the Palestinians were sort of clustered. That was where they were living, yeah. Okay.
And I guess those borders remain more or less the same up until the next big event in 1967?
Yeah, exactly. And so 67, I mean, that whole war probably deserves like a show of its own. But just to sort of fill in the blank spot in the history, the Nakba was the initial expulsion of Palestinians. Many of them were internally displaced within Palestine itself. Many ended up in like Lebanon or Jordan or in foreign refugee camps. But yeah, the large majority of the Palestinian population, I think, ended up around Gaza and the West Bank. Now, in 1967, there was a conflict with Egypt. I think that was the major, belligerent against the Israelis. And, of course, there's a lot of context here. I think it was it Menachem Begin, I believe, who said in a speech before the Knesset or before some official Israeli body, who admitted basically that the war of 1967 was a war of choice. It was not like we were not threatened, because it's a common claim among pro-Israel people that the War of 67 was some existential conflict and that Israel's existence was threatened. Well, Menachem Begin pretty clearly, and I think he was an intelligence official and a prime minister of Israel, if I'm not mistaken. And so this very high-ranking guy says that the War of 67 was really a war of choice on our part. However, the major outcome for the Palestinians of the 67 war was sort of the drawing of armistice lines around the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the Israeli occupation of those two territories. because prior to that, in the period between the Nakba and 67, the Israelis didn't occupy the West Bank of the Gaza Strip, as far as I know. But after 67, that is when they began to hold those territories.
Okay, so it just, to be clear, this is, kind of 1967 would be the last time that the Palestinians had like kind of self-rule or self-authority really in what was their land.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's not like in the period between the Nakba and 1967, I don't know if it's quite fair to say that they had total autonomy. I think they were probably living the aftermath of that giant upheaval. I don't think they necessarily had like strong, robust political institutions. I mean, let's remember too that during the British Mandate, after the two Arab revolts in the 1930s, the British basically decimated Palestinian leadership and, disarmed them and imprisoned a lot of the leaders or expelled them. And so the remainder of Palestinian like political leadership after the Nakba probably was not very robust.
All right. One other thing I want to talk about before we get to what's going on present day, Will, is the right of return, because I guess starting in 1947 even, or 48, you have the, so many of these people are now refugees. They have been removed from the land that was ancestrally theirs, their family's land, that they've been kicked out of. And so a lot of Palestinians advocate for what they call the right of return. And do you want to explain what this is?
Yeah, sure. So I would say the Palestinian cause generally has like three major planks. And definitely through like the BDS movement, as the Palestinian cause as articulated by the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I believe the three planks are: 1, end the occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza; 2, equal rights for Arab citizens of Israel; and 3, as you said, the right of return for refugees. And so this basically means allowing Palestinian refugees to return to their property that was either stolen from them or that they were expelled from, that they were chased off of, either as part of the Nakba or as part of the sort of upheavals after the 67 war, or as part of the 67 war. And so this actually includes returning property within Israel to Palestinians. Like that's the more touchy part of the right of return. Sometimes it's Palestinian refugees who are just internally displaced, asking to go back to their property. But sometimes that means Palestinians asking to go back to Israel proper, which is obviously much more touchy to the Israeli government. And the right of return has been codified several times in international law. The least of which is not the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194, but as we were talking off air, it's in several other places too, in the Geneva Conventions and otherwise. And so that is basically what the right of return is.
Right, and this is guaranteed to all refugees. It's not like I think a lot of times, the Israeli side likes to play victims at the UN and saying that, the UN is so mean to them and passes all these aggressive legislation. I mean, this is, something that's guaranteed to refugees, not to the Palestinians,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, too, because this is so recent that, there are sometimes people who are still alive that were kicked off of their property in 1948 and 1967. They still have the key to the house and the deed and the title and everything. And so this isn't like we're talking about, 2,000 years ago, some obscure war pushed this guy's ancestors off. We're talking like either his mother or him or his grandmother owned this piece of property and they were kicked off within living memory. And so I think that kind of makes it extra, sensitive.
Right. And, even, to add to that, not just at 67, but even, up until today, every year more Palestinian homes are destroyed. Sometimes they're just seized from them and given to Israeli family. Other times they're paved over for an Israeli settler only road. But, Palestinians continue to be made refugees, as part of the occupation here.
Right. No doubt. This is not just some historical thing that happened decades ago. It's happening up until this day. Homes are being bulldozed and people are still being expelled from their property.
Right. So, kind of bringing us up to 6 weeks ago now, on March 30th, I believe, was the first of what was 6 or 7 protests called the Great Return March protest. And these protests were carried out by the people living in Gaza. And what they were trying to do is say that, hey, we have a right to return to our family's land, and, some other, things that the Palestinian movement looks for. Now, during these Return March protests, over 100 Palestinians were killed by Israeli snipers. Thousands were injured, many by live fire rounds. Others were injured by these steel-coated rubber-coated steel slugs that they use. Others, suffered, injuries from the very serious tear gas that the Israelis use. And so you have, like I said, over 100 dead. dead, thousands injured, over 100 amputations. You have, people who were shot in the leg, looking to transfer to an Israeli hospital so they could save their leg. However, the Israeli government denied them the right to travel to a hospital. And so, this goes on for weeks. And I think, Will, maybe you could understand this very important detail, which is what is life like right now in Gaza that makes these Palestinian peaceful protesters go to the border of Gaza to face tear gas and being shot and sometimes killed by Israeli snipers.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked this question because it's virtually like you don't really hear it in a lot of the mainstream media. It's not often asked simply why are these people willing to endure such risk? It'd be real easy to just not go to the protest and not risk getting shot at or getting, we've all heard the stories of the IDF aiming for, to get amputations or aiming for the genitals or things like this. Why would somebody face that? Why would somebody take on that kind of risk? And while it may have something to do with the conditions of the Gaza Strip. Now, if you've listened to any media that's not completely pro-Israel on Gaza, you probably have heard the descriptor that Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison. And I think that characterization is largely true. While the outright Israeli occupation of Gaza ended in 2005, which is a whole, subject of its own, the Israeli government still maintains a real draconian restriction on the territory, on Gaza. And so they basically have a blockade, and Gaza's borders are completely locked down. Israel decides what goes in and out of the country. And it's not even a country. In terms of the territory, the Israelis count calories of Palestinians to make sure I think the quote was, hungry but not starving. We'll keep them on a diet. The Israeli government has said. The Gazans aren't even allowed to, they have no airport, so they really can't even leave. It's up to either the Egyptian government or the Israeli government, who sometimes seem to be acting in cahoots with one another. The Gazan fishermen can't even fish off of their own coast. They're not allowed to go very far off the coast to fish, and the waters have been overfished. And so there's really no prospect for that. And speaking of employment in Gaza, it's somewhere around 50%. 50. I'm talking 50%, not 15. And because of all these things, because of the inability to import materials, because of the inability to build, because of the lack of there's rolling blackouts because of the lack of electricity and power infrastructure, the United Nations has said that Gaza will be uninhabitable, I believe was their term, by the year 2020, which is rapidly approaching. And to sort of top this all off, Gaza is ruled by a very corrupt political leadership of Hamas, who, if you listen to pro-Israel people, you'll often hear them point out how Hamas spends money on weapons instead of aid or instead of humanitarian relief and things like that. And some of this stuff is true. Hamas is not. A lot of the time Palestinian political leadership seems to be more looking out for itself and its own power than it is for the average Palestinian. And so all of these things are culminating to create absolute desperation in the Gaza Strip, particularly Gaza. It's bad in the West Bank too, where there's still occupation and settlement, but Gaza is really getting desperate and dire. And this, I think, is what motivates the thousands of people to come out and protest like we've seen.
Right. And some other important details about Gaza that when I read, kind of really helped me to understand that is an open air prison. 80% of the 2 million people that live in Gaza are refugees. They're not, from there. These are people who are displaced from their homes now in Gaza and are not allowed to leave, right? We saw, them walking to the border and being shot at. And so obviously they're not, allowed to leave. The other thing is that there was a ban on the importation of concrete and wheelchairs. As Will described, the IDF snipers regularly target the lower limbs of people and the groin area, which, I mean, to me, it's just one the nastiest things to do. Shoot somebody in the groin, it's best stabbing somebody in the back. But anyways, in the most recent round of protesting, there's apparently been a lot more amputations that have to occur, not only because of just insufficient healthcare facilities to attend to the wounds, because it's not like the Israelis are letting people be transferred to Israeli hospitals to seek treatment when the Palestinian and Gazan hospitals are overrun. But they're using bullets that actually, I guess, open up more, kind of like a hollow point, but I heard them called butterfly or banana bullets. and it's basically causing massive exit wounds and more amputation. And so you'll regularly see, I mean, if you look at these protest videos, you'll see like an amazing number of people in wheelchairs, on crutches, or just missing lower limbs. I don't know how many times you see a guy with no lower limbs sitting in the dirt, throwing rods in a slingshot at the, border fence or whatever. And so the situation there is nothing short of unimaginable to somebody living in the West. I heard at times they only have 4 hours of power a day. I can't imagine what my life would be like without air conditioning, to be quite honest. And these people don't even have lights.
Yeah, and what's really alarming, too, about the Gaza sort of like demographic situation is that Gaza is sort of like a time bomb right now. They're a massively youthful society. And so like a huge proportion of Gazans are children. And so sooner or later, these people are all going to grow up and maybe they'll have children, too. And so like you can see how, with the unemployment and everything, this is really going to become a problem in the coming years of just like what are people in Gaza going to do? As I said, the United Nations has described this as uninhabitable within 2 years, less than 2 years now.
Right. And so this is very important because, we're like really 18 months away from the UN estimate that Gaza is going to be uninhabitable. Like I said, you have 2 million people living there. And then for 6 weeks, they marched towards the fence, that you could either call the border of Gaza or the fence of their prison, because it looks a lot more like a prison fence to me, since there's snipers sitting on the other side of it. And they're, being shot at, Will. And you've had journalists shot and killed. You've had young teenagers shot and killed. You've had, tons of people who are shot in the back. There's been thousands of people with bullet injuries that weren't fatal. And so I guess, the moral thing that people say is, well, because of Hamas, Israel has to defend itself from these people. I mean, what do you think of the morality?
Right. I think what you just said, the thing about, it's all because of Hamas, I think it turns everything completely on its head. And as I also made a point to say earlier, I'm not a big fan of Hamas. I don't support a crazy Islamic fundamentalist militant movement, but I do believe in justice, and I do believe that Palestinians have the right to not only protest, but in fact, I think the Palestinians have the right to actually protest with arms, to resist with arms. And it's not just my radical libertarian opinion. I'm pretty sure international law recognizes the right of people who are oppressed and occupied or whatever. Even though Gazans you can't officially say are occupied, but de facto, more or less, they're occupied. They're dominated. People under domination, though, under international law, have the right to resist. And so I would certainly, you don't need Hamas in that picture to see it okay to resist.
Can we expand on that just a little bit more? Because there's always this demand that the Palestinians have to do everything completely peaceful. They're always saying, well, there's no Palestinian Gandhi, or there's no Palestinian MLK, and that's why they're not free, or they don't have a better life.
Right. I mean, I guess that's a question of strategy. If they had been more compromising and less militant about it, would they have been able to earn greater concessions? I don't know, perhaps. However, if you look at the history of even Hamas, which is one of the more militant organizations, you can see that their leadership taking, despite what their charter says, their leadership has taken positions over the years that say, generally they would accept the 67 borders and would not continue to fight and wouldn't continue to make a big stink about it. And so, yeah, I think there have been sort of attempts to reach out and make agreements. However, there's been a thing called the peace process going on for decades now, and it appears that peace process, the Oslo Accords and the Camp David Accords and stuff, it appears that these are just designed by the Israelis and their allies, the United States, to put the whole to freeze the situation, basically, to just freeze the status quo until the Israelis can get more movement. And so the Palestinians see this and say there's a peace process that does nothing. And so I think that sort of encourages people toward militancy and violence and stuff.
Right. And I read a pretty good article that was recommended to me by Scott Horn that ran in Vanity Fair in 2008, but basically explained how the Bush policy in Palestine created a conflict between Fatah and Hamas, that Hamas ended up winning and then seizing a lot of arms the United States was trying to get to Fatah, and really strengthening Hamas, especially in Gaza, that way. And so, when everybody says, but Hamas, you have to see, know that just like any other radical Muslim group, the United States probably had some role in them being, strengthened or propped up.
Right, sure. And that, as you're talking about, helping like to try to bolster that split between Fatah and Hamas, that ended up in a Hamas electoral victory, I believe, in Gaza. And that's what led the Israelis to withdraw their settlers from Gaza. This all happened around the same time, I believe. And an Israeli diplomat, Dov Weissglass, I think told Haaretz in an interview, the liberal Israeli newspaper, told them that this whole thing was to freeze the peace process, to put it in formaldehyde, the withdrawal of settlers from Gaza. And so that was sort of their intention there, is like they just exploited that whole situation. As you pointed out, that was very skewed by the United States' policies and actions. And then the Israelis used that outcome to, again, make sure peace didn't happen, to ensure that they always had the upper hand.
Right. And so another thing that people will say that justifies the Israeli snipers shooting the Palestinian protesters is that the Palestinians are, I guess, acting aggressively against the fence or something like that. The weapons that the Palestinians, the Gazans have used are burning tires, and this is basically to obstruct the view of the tire or of the snipers. The black smoke makes you can't really see through it. They also use tennis rackets to hit tear gas canisters back over the fence that are shot at them by the Israeli army. They throw rocks, sometimes with slingshots, sometimes with what looks like a biblical, David versus Goliath slingshot. Have you seen? Do you know what I'm talking about here, Will?
Yeah, like this,
like the kind you spin over your head a couple times.
Right, like a sling. I think they call it just a sling.
And then there have been some reports of Molotov cocktails attached to kites that they try to get to drift over the border or over the fence there. And that is the extent of whatever offensive that the Palestinians can apparently muster here. And so can you see any way where you could justify lethal force against those people?
No, I mean, certainly not. The level, the weaponry being employed here by the Palestinians is very ridiculous and primitive, and I don't think has led to a single death or injury on the Israeli side during these protests. Now, I will make the distinction and say, I don't think it's quite right to say these protests are completely nonviolent. I think there's a little bit of violence going on with the throwing of rocks and trying to catch things on fire with Molotov cocktails. However, I would kind of say that they're unarmed protests. It's not people with guns resisting. It's still pretty much a protest. And so I just think we should, we don't do ourselves any favors by saying something is nonviolent when it's not truly completely nonviolent. However, it is sort of unarmed protesting, and I think that we can genuinely say. People aren't using weapons of war here, guns or anything like that, or bombs. It's all pretty much homemade, nonsense.
It's non-lethal force. I mean,
exactly.
There hasn't been a single Israeli injured. I don't even know if there's been sufficient damage done to the fence that the Israelis have actually had replace any fencing or anything like that. I think a couple times they shot people who were trying to cut their way through the fence or something like that. But I just compare it to the situation that you had with the migrant caravan coming to the United States. And you had, for weeks saying that these people are going to come to the U.S. border and sneak through. And I don't know, can you imagine, Will, if Trump ordered the National Guard to shoot these people in the ankles as they came towards the United States? And I'm sure the Trump excuse would be, well, some of them are gang members. And that's probably more or less true. I'm sure blowback from the war on drugs has created enough, and a lucrative enough business for the cartels that some of them are trying to get themselves in the United States. And yeah, these are probably bad people, just if 100 Palestinians or Gazans were able to get through the fence, yeah, maybe some member of Hamas would get through along with that group. But can you imagine what the outcry would be if the Trump ordered them being shot in the ankles? Just that, not even kill the 100 Palestinians that have been killed.
Right. I mean, I could certainly imagine Trump doing that, shooting people, having these immigrants shot. However, like you said, the response would be completely different, and that's where we'd see the distinction. We'd see a massive, the world response would be massive outrage and condemnation of the Trump administration. Whereas sort of the response to the Palestinians, a lot of the international community is pretty much behind the Palestinian cause, but the response to it is sort of mixed and mealy-mouthed. And like you're saying, there's all these objections of, but Hamas, and but they're burning tires, so we can shoot all of them. And I just think the narrative gets very skewed.
Well, and I think one of the reasons for that, and this is something good, I think, just for me and Will to bring up is that, anybody who takes this position, it could get the anti-Semitic term thrown at them and them saying, oh, well, the only reason you say what you say about the Nakba is because it's, you're an anti-Semite and you love Hitler and all this other nonsense. And, for people, it really does bother me if somebody would say that about me. I don't call a Nazi or anti-Semite, and that's not the person I am. However, on one side of this fight, you have a 16-year-old boy with a rock in his slingshot smaller than his fist, and on the other side, you have a tank and then a sniper hiding on a dirt hill behind that tank with a sniper scope and everything like that. And that boy throws the rock and then a bullet flies through his brain. Well, it's not hard for me to determine who's the aggressor.
Sure. And I mean, I guess some Palestinian activists might sort of take this identity politics kind of like route where they're for the Arabs and they're against the Jews or whatever. But the vast majority of people that I run into who care about this issue, it's because of principles, universal principles of justice, not about identity politics of, oh, I love the Arabs or I love the Jews or I hate the Jews. It has nothing to do with that. You shouldn't even really have to say this, but like in my own case personally, and I think for you too, Kyle, that we admire some of the same people. My heroes are all Jewish. Like, I have nothing against Jewish people in general. I wouldn't even know what to not like them for. And so I don't know, like you shouldn't have to make that defense of yourself, but unfortunately you do often, because of how often people, they approach the issue entirely from the perspective of identity politics, of I'm with this group and if you're not, you must be against me and my entire identity.
Right. And, we made this, you could listen to the first 193 episodes of the show. You could hear I make the exact same criticisms and hold my own government to the same standard. And I'm not anti-white, so
right.
I don't know how I could be anti-Semite. But I don't know. It's the kind of thing that comes up when you do a show on a topic like this. Right.
And we also, I don't think we can be pro-Arab in general, because all these other shows we have of us criticizing Saudi and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. You can't call us pro or anti-Arab, I think, because we take the pro-Palestinian side and the anti-Saudi, so it's not so simple.
Okay, well, so we also had the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, and on the show in the past, we've actually talked about this issue a little bit and why it was important to the people of the Palestinians and the people of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and how this does seem to be somewhat of a Trump pulling out the two-state solution, out from under the negotiation table. So, do you have anything you want to say about the opening of the embassy?
Yeah, I just think it's an unfortunate sign. I think it's clearly a sign that the Trump administration is really taking the Israeli line here, is really taking that side, which is pretty clear from his other policies and his other personnel, too. Like, the presence of Kushner and the closeness of the familial ties with Kushner, who's part of a, high-ranking or high-profile Israeli family who builds, who I think is involved in building settlements. With the policies toward Iran, you can just tell this administration is really taking the Israeli line, and the moving and the opening of the U.S. Embassy, I think, is just another sign of that.
Right. And I think one thing that shows that is the White House response to the protest in Gaza. And I'm going to go ahead and play a really quick clip here of that.
On the issue of peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, when was the last time the White House reached out to Palestinian leadership? And will, given the high numbers of casualties, Palestinians calling what's happening today a massacre, will the White House be reaching out?
Well, I don't honestly have an answer for you on that. I'll get back to you.
Just follow up then.
Sure.
I mean, Jared Kushner in his speech pointed a finger at the Palestinians, saying they were responsible for provoking violence. But given the fact that it's only Palestinians who are being killed, should Israel not shoulder some of the blame?
Well, as I said earlier, we believe Hamas bears the responsibility. Look, this is a propaganda attempt. I mean, this is a gruesome and unfortunate propaganda attempt. I think the Israeli government has spent weeks trying to handle this without violence. And we find it very unfortunate.
Rocks 50 meters from the wall, and we're faced with sniper attack. I mean, is the White House in denial of the split-screen reality that's occurring?
Again, we believe that Hamas is responsible for this.
Okay, well, so I guess, we've kind of already discussed this, but what just is your reaction to that clip?
Yeah, that's such nonsense. The reporter's asking him, well, what about the Israelis just murdering Palestinians and the fact that the Palestinians aren't doing anything to really provoke or justify that? Like, can you address that specific question? He just goes, nope, it's just Hamas. We blame Hamas. It's clearly just like the Likud line. They're just like completely parroting that. So yeah, I find that pretty preposterous.
Right. And the Gazans that she is describing right there are children. at least on the May 15th, or 14th, I guess, protests, 6 of those who died were minors, and I saw videos of one of them. I mean, the kid looked 14 years old. There's no way, had he, shot that rocket at an Israeli soldier 3 feet from the Israeli soldier, the soldier would have been fine. You know what I mean?
Right.
He just didn't have the strength to hurt him.
Right. They're just looking for any reason to escalate force, and so they'll take a 3-year-old tossing his pebble. And the last thing I guess I want to say about that clip is just, with him saying that this is a propaganda attempt by Hamas, that's not what the international agencies on the ground are reporting. In fact, Doctors Without Borders said in a report, most of our wounded patients say they have nothing to lose, no hope, no jobs, nothing. They tell our staff that they just want to go back and die at the protest sites. And so, it's pretty clear that this isn't Hamas. This is just the popular feeling that, it's better to at least go and stand on the, I guess, edge of your cage and get as close as you can to freedom. Then, as we know, as the UN report says, that this will be uninhabitable land in 18 months. I guess that means people are just going to lay down and start dying of deprivation. Right. I mean, how can you blame Hamas for it's obviously not just Hamas propaganda that there's 50% unemployment there. So the things that these people are saying, their desperation is obviously real. It's not just, some Hamas talking point that they've been, brainwashed into believing.
All right. Well, do you have anything else to add on this topic, Al? Did we miss any points that you think are really important?
I mean, yeah, there's such a long history here that of course we did skip over some stuff, but I think for the purpose of this discussion, I think we covered everything.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Will, for coming on the show again today. Everybody, Will Porter, his work can be found at libertarianinstitute.org, where you can find this show as well. You can also find his work at antiwar.com and consortiumnews.com. Go ahead and list your Twitter and your Patreon again, Will.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate you giving me a chance to do that. My Twitter, you can find me at WKPANCAP, ANCAP. That's my handle on there. And then for Patreon, you can find me at patreon.com/WKPjournalist if you'd like to contribute to what I do.
All right. And you can find this show at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, at libertarianinstitute.org. You can find my daily news roundup there as well. My news website is immersionnews.com. I'm on YouTube and BitChute at Immersion News, and then Twitter at KYAAALE. Thanks everybody so much for tuning in.
Thanks, Kyle.